Hello, everyone. Welcome to Don't Worry, We'll Talk It Out. I am, of course, your host, Randon. And before I get into the intro here, I'd like to kind of lay out a little bit of the topics that I'm going to be discussing today. So, of course, as many of you can see now, I have YouTube. This is going to be one of my first videos to go on YouTube. Got the ring light and everything. I'm basically one step away from becoming a TikToker. But for this podcast, man, I wanted to discuss a number of the very obviously serious, aggressive, and traumatic things that have been occurring over the last 2 or 3 days in America. And of course, these are all centered around the unjust death of George Floyd. I'm not going to spend a lot of time particularly about the event regarding George Floyd. I think that's going to be a whole nother episode altogether. But I do want to focus on some things that have been on my mind these last 2 days regarding the riots that have been occurring, primarily, of course, in Minneapolis. So in that, I spend a lot of time on Don't Worry, We'll Talk It Out, discussing psychological concepts and where they come from, the past, present, and the future of these concepts. And of course, I think it's a perfect time to come on here and to talk about what a riot really means in terms of political, kind of ideologies and where those stem from and why this riot in particular, I think, is history changing. So I'll come on here. I discuss that. That'll be one of my first topics. And then after that, I wanted to really just try to give some sort of overarching view of where I feel the collective human consciousness seems to be going. We have had so many traumatic events that have happened to us, and not just from an individual standpoint. I truly do believe, and maybe not from a spiritual level, but I do believe that humans are connected, whether this is through evolution or just some sort of innate instinctual connection, of course, to the Homo sapien species. I think we're all connected. And when we deal with these very traumatic events that require an incredible amount of empathy and like I said, trauma, even watching these videos are traumatic for us. So I wanted to come on here and discuss that and really see where I see the human experience kind of going from here. More discussions about the changing social reality that we see ourselves in. And it's such a strange time, and it's a lot to compact and just to, yeah. So I don't even know. But yeah, we can go ahead and get into the intro and we'll kick this thing right off. You are listening to Don't Worry, We'll Talk It Up. Like I said, my first topic is going to be centered around the psychology of a riot and what that really means, especially from an American standpoint. So I'll use a couple of contemporary modern ideas right now and a couple of old ideas and try to combine them to try to make sense of what's happening. So let's start with something that everyone is very familiar with, the Joker film that recently came out by Todd Phillips, very popular film. And of course, the idea of Joker is that you have this loner who sparks a full-blown riot, with hundreds of mobs all across the city of Gotham. This is one man who essentially sparks a movement, right? But the idea of that movie is not just that one man can start a movement, which is, of course, very possible. But in order for that person to start that movement, there has to be a commonplace, kind of a powder keg of these things of certain things like corruption and different types of police brutality, of course, in this instance, certain aspects of greed that continue to perpetrate the actual system, which eventually leads to the lower class, or in this case, the normal citizens, resisting this system and rioting and in some cases destroying the city. And this is it's a very complex concept, but a lot of this derives from the philosopher Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes believed that all humans are essentially chaotic and that we revel in the chaotic nature of human experience. Now, an interesting kind of overarching view of a lot of these tensions that I'm going to discuss later on in the podcast actually comes from another movie, which is Spike Lee's masterpiece, Do the Right Thing, which I think is a perfect and prime example of a number of the racial tensions, political disparities, and continuing kind of cyclical nature of history that continues to, I think, just bring down American culture and society as a whole. Now, this a little bit of a spoilers, of course. I actually most all the spoilers for the movie Do the Right Thing. If you haven't seen it, probably skip ahead a little bit. But essentially, the idea of Do the Right Thing is that you have in New York City, it's the hottest day of the year, and all of this kind of boiling tension between a majority of the white characters, and some of them are Italian Americans, and the black characters in the movie who happen to be poor in a poor neighborhood. It boils up to the climax of the film, which essentially is a riot, a looting, and a burning down of a symbolic area, which happens to be the local pizzeria where a lot of the action in the movie takes place. And I think I had been thinking about Do the Right Thing for a number of days, and then to see the culmination of the actual riots and burning down of the local precinct in Minneapolis, I think was very, not only frightening, of course, to see that. It was very scary, but it's also very symbolic what they did there. So I think it perfectly coincides with what Do the Right Thing is actually trying to say. So after they burn down the local pizzeria, and you have essentially the final standoff of the lead character, who is played by Spike Lee. His name is Mookie, and the kind of the antagonist of, I guess, of the movie, which is Sal, who is the owner of the pizzeria. Now, Sal's implicit and explicit biases of racial ideologies are confirmed, actually, by the burning down of his store. He goes, essentially, it validated his racist idea that poor blacks are more violent and they're more endued to actually harm someone or something. Now, from Mookie's perspective, of course, it's the exact opposite. He thinks, no, actually, we needed to get this anger out of us. And in actuality, Sal might be better off anyway, because he was insured and he can build the place back up, and he's not really going to lose that much money. And Spike Lee thinks, well, he's pretty much fine. But the real ending of the movie is actually not even from their interaction. It's from the final character of the film, who's played by Samuel L. Jackson, who plays a radio host throughout the whole movie. He essentially says, yes, this was the hottest day in New York's history, but in the future, there will be more hot days and there'll be hotter days. What kind of got me to even come on here in the first place to kind of, I won't say rush, but I decided, all right, I'm going to wake up today and try to make sense of what's happening throughout the world. And I'm seeing a lot of course, differing ideologies about what it really means to loot, what it really means to riot. And these ideas are so complex and they have a past. So I really wanted to deal with the past of what a riot really entails and the psychology behind that. So we can go ahead and get into that. And to go back real quick to Do the Right Thing, and then moving forward, the ending of Do the Right Thing essentially says that one of the most important pictures, I feel, in civil rights history, is a picture of Martin Luther King shaking hands with Malcolm X. And they have a quote from Malcolm X basically saying that, violence can be necessary, and advocating for violence against, supremacists or just racists in general, compared to Martin Luther King's obviously primarily empathetic and peaceful notion. And these two contradictory ideologies of the black movement, just the civil rights movement as a whole, I think has always been a very difficult thing for a number of not just Americans, but of course primarily black Americans to come to terms with. When is it right to use what you feel is just violence compared to when to be primarily empathetic and nonviolent? And I think the ending of that perfectly encapsulates that. And we're seeing this ramped up now, of course, because of the riots. So let's get into some of the psychology behind what it means to be rioting or to be in a mob. So the classical ideas of what we view as a mob mentality comes from the Mad Mob theory. The Mad Mob theory essentially says that when an individual is in a large mob, let's say 50 to 100 people, a large group of people. You have an ideology that you support, but what the catch is that when an individual is in this mob, they lose their sense of self and they lose their sense of rationality and reason while in this crowd. And they would do things that they normally wouldn't do if they were by themselves. Now, this may include, if one person in the crowd throws a Molotov at a cop car or something, then likely there's probably going to be 5 other Molotovs that return. And again, likely is that most of the people who returned those Molotovs were probably wouldn't do that, right? If they were by themselves, just walking around. Now, these are some aspects of the classical version of what we would view as the mob theory, but these explanations are, I think, a little outdated because they do not really, they lack the explanatory power to be able to really encapsulate where these feelings of frustration and tension are really brimming from. But what we have today is obviously continuing to see these rising examples of extreme anger and extreme tension, especially in cities that have been so already traumatized by previous incidents of either blatant racism or just unjust and irresponsible police tactics that actually fail to de-escalate the situation. They actually only escalate the situation, right? And we've seen over the past maybe 5 or 6 years after the killings of, say, Michael Brown, we have, and when I say we, I mean majority of the Black political activists that we see, like Black Lives Matter. We're beginning to see the protests, which all were, a majority of them at the very beginning have become, were always peaceful, right? They were met with aggression from a majority of the police forces that were in the cities. And now it's getting to the point where, in this example of George Floyd's killing captured on cell phone, one of the most egregious forms of injustice that I think America has ever seen. We never got a chance to, we didn't have the ability to record Emmett Till's murdering, but to see this, I think it finally, this was the straw that broke the camel's back for a majority of Black Americans. And this is why it's came to this point. And as I mentioned in my little Spike Lee monologue of Do the Right Thing, is that the continuous dichotomy of the two aspects of Black activism from two of the most reputable, Black activists ever, in Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Those contradictory ideas and ideologies of how to deal with this, a Black oppression from political and institutionalized systems, we struggle internally to try to figure out how to best come up with the right strategy. There is no playbook for protesting and rioting. I'm sure there are, but it's not a one size fits all to whatever your particular idea of oppression is. And I think it's as we continue to learn more about the George Floyd murder, it's going to come evident that a lot of people, and I feel a lot of Black Americans, are going to have to come to the terms of, will I protest peacefully, or are we going to do things that are pretty unheard of in a lot of American history, like burning down a police precinct, right? Now, who knows what's going to happen once the National Guards come in, but I'm not really trying to focus on a lot of that aspects right now. But what I am trying to focus on are the continuing social dynamics that we're seeing that makes it really difficult to find who is right and who is wrong in these situations, because it seems that no matter what Black Americans do, a lot of the institutions have a problem with it. We've tried the peaceful and empathetic views of Martin Luther King, from kneeling from the peaceful protests all the way starting from the 60s, marching and everything. The trauma in a lot of these black communities, there are going to be people who decide that they are no longer going to take what they are, of course, they are perceived as brutalization and an animalistic nature of how they're treated. So that's what I'm a little worried about. And over the next coming days, we will see what happens. Of course, popping up next to me is Trump's egregious tweet, one of his most violent tweets that he's ever tweeted, and we will see what happens in the next coming days as the National Guard goes into Minneapolis, and hopefully, violence will not beget violence. But as to kind of get back on track, I'm kind of going on a little bit of a tangent there, but to get back on track in terms of the continuing psychology of the riots from the Black American perspective, like I said, that continuing dichotomy of how to approach these things will only get more difficult, I feel, and it is very, very scary. I think it's also important to bring up the continuing rising tensions and high levels of emotion and anxiety that all of us are continuing to experience here in our homes. And during the pandemic, everything that we're seeing on the news is only going to be more riled up, because there's only going to be increasing levels of, like I said, anxiety, paranoia, examples of toxicity kind of spreading, disagreements between whether it's political parties, racial ideologies, religion. It's just going to continue until I feel the idea of normalcy. I don't think America has ever really been normal. It's always been the idea of normalcy. And until that is really presented and kind of perpetrated back into the American culture, which I don't feel really returning within at least a year and a half, in terms of we're back to fully operational, I guess you can say. These rising aspects of disagreements between people, between, like I said, political parties and things like this, they're only going to get worse. And as we're kept into our houses all day, these things, they build and they build and they build. And obviously what we're seeing with these riots from the majority of Black activist protesters, right? They have been sitting on this stuff for days. Or for the example of Ahmaud Arbery's case, people knew about this for 2 months, and they kind of had to sit on it. And by the time it reached the quote unquote mainstream media, tensions were at 100%, and everything was too high to calm down. So it's just it's a sad situation, but these continuing examples of brutality in certain institutions from a systemic standpoint it's great that we can broadcast this, and I will say, I didn't want to come on here and really I was in a very, disappointed mood, of course, but as of today, we're already seeing different, at least some ideas of good news. The actual officer, as I'm speaking right now, I just learned about that. The officer, I think it's Officer Chauvin, I think that's how you pronounce his last name, has been arrested and charged with third-degree murder for the killing of George Floyd. And we will see what comes of that. I think also manslaughter is added to that. So we are seeing a little bit of progress. And what I wanted to come on here to say, to be kind of optimistic toward the kind of end of this aspect, is that, I am more probably hopeful and optimistic than I've been in a long time about a social issue. I have seen people that I honestly never would have expected on my timeline to post very long, detailed and eloquent examples of how, maybe they have realized, maybe aspects of their white privilege, or they have had, revelations in sort of what Black Lives Matter and certain activist groups have been talking about for a long time, and because of the the obvious examples of, like I said, unjust and very immoral policing tactics that we've seen. I've seen more people than ever, post about this. And, a thing that I really feel like I have to say is that is really coincides around activism, right? Like I see a lot of people can sometimes put down other people if they post online about, say, a social, some sort of social activist thing that they care about, right? I mean, we've seen dozens of these already, and we're just in May, right? And I'm not just talking about from a black perspective, say a black American highlighting police brutality or other ideas of systemic, racism and oppression. It can also be, uh, say Muslim Americans who live in America, and they're highlighting certain crimes against humanity that are happening in certain Middle Eastern countries. And some people might see that and say, well, why are they posting it on Instagram? They're posting an Instagram story. You're not really doing anything. But this is the first time in my short life that I've really understood that's just not true. Activism comes in all forms. And of course, if we had everyone only post on social media, that wouldn't do a thing. That's absolutely true. But the more people we bring, we bring a good awareness to certain issues, online activism does help. And it's actually I feel tremendously responsible. I sound like Trump. It's actually tremendously responsible for bringing up the issues, bringing up the conversation, which thus leads to examples of actual on ground activism, whether that's protesting, whether that's appearing on, say, some sort of mainstream media site or news show and presenting a different aspect of the argument or detailing your actual experience as, say, a black American living in America. So, I don't want to. I've been very careful about that, and that has been something that I think, me personally, I've kind of grown to understand during this year. And I'm never gonna. I feel I have been, in an unright way. I have criticized some people beforehand, of only posting online and maybe not, calling an actual representative or donating to some sort of campaign or some sort of fundraising event. I don't think it's necessary for people to every single person doesn't always have the wherewithal or the knowledge to be able to do that all the time. And it's a hassle, and it is tough, and who knows actually where your money's going and all. That's a whole nother thing. But I just wanted to bring up that issue because I think it's very important, and the amount of posts and the amount of actual detailed responses that I've seen from people that I never would have expected to really talk about these things is really eye opening for me, and it's really it's just really good to see that, at a time like this, of course. And but I will end this really by saying, just reiterating the importance of understanding where the conversation is going to go from here. We have seen over the past 2 or 3 days a number of rioting and going into whether it's large or small businesses in these areas in Minneapolis. But yet, a number of people are going to propagate the idea that this is counterintuitive to George Floyd, the actual investigation of the murder, which, whether or not you disagree with that, I think it is important to understand that the people who are going to propagate this will say nothing when, say, a majority white school or college, say their football team wins a national championship, and they go out into the streets that night and burn and flip police cars, destroy the city, and make a mockery of the city when they win. But yet no one discusses that. But when we actually have a genuine loss of human life, they don't speak on the subject until the rioting and the loitering starts. So I think it's very important to consider. And going forward, just you have to understand the frameworks in which they're going to try to frame these things, I'm not going to name names, but some people who would try to push an agenda, and push an idea of certain types of authoritarian political ideologies. So so yeah, guys. This will be, like I said, my first YouTube video and everything, and I really hope you guys like it. It's a short one, but I have a lot coming up. I really wanted to do one about the psychoanalysis of the news media and how that instills fear and ideas of depression and stuff. And then I also have a few kind of a video concepts that I'll have coming out soon. And yeah, I hope everyone is staying safe during the pandemic. Stay inside, wear a mask if you go out, and try to keep you and your family safe and your community. And don't get too bogged down sometimes with social media. I think it's important. I'm going to probably continue to reiterate that, not only for you guys, but for myself, to try to disconnect and try to give your mental acuity a break, from all the anger that can come from what we see online and the trauma that we see. These videos that we've seen of black men being being killed by police officers is very traumatizing, and a lot of this trauma doesn't come out until later. Once we're actually around an environment that might induce that. And these are when these traumatic events are really gonna rear their ugly head. So, yeah, everyone, again, I appreciate you listening. I have been Randon, and you've been watching and listening to Don't Worry, We'll Talk It Out.